Hi, it's Grandma here, and I'm reading The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. Um, this is the last reading I'll be doing on this book. I do want to remind you that there's other things in the book to look at. For instance, there's a ten Boom family tree. There is also a timeline that you can look at, but I won't be reading through those. I'm continuing the reading of the three visions. We've already had one vision. Betsie had several visions while she was in Ravensbrück. One was that they would be free by New Year's Day, and it came true. Betsie had died, and in that way she was free, but Corrie also was released on New Year's Day. So we have still two more visions to go as to completing the visions that Betsie had before she died. We have noticed in the first part of this chapter a difference in how the nurses in Groningen are compared to the nurses in Ravensbrück. In Ravensbrück, they paid no attention to the patients. They made fun of them. They taunted them. They were cruel. Whereas in Groningen, where Corrie has met up with a nurse, and they had no beds open, but there was one bed that one of the staff members usually used, and they let her use that. They had a hot bath all ready for her. They treated her with kindness. It's a matter of how you treat people, not just the facility and what it has. She was treated with dignity, and like she was a person who mattered. And that's important. That's important for us even when we're in the healthcare system in the hospitals to be treated that way. So she has made it through a very long and difficult journey to the Netherlands, or Holland, as she calls it. She's now at her brother's house. She's been welcomed by his wife, Tina, and two of their children. Her brother now is walking with a cane, and he hopes that someday his son Keek will come back. He had been taken away to Germany to a camp also. So the brother lives in the town of Hilversum. I spent 2 weeks in Hilversum, trying to adjust to what my eyes had told me that first moment. Willem was dying. Only he seemed unaware of it as he hobbled along the halls of his home, bringing comfort and counsel to the sick people in his care. They had over 50 patients at the moment, but what I could not get over was the number of young women in help, nurses' aides, kitchen helpers, secretaries. It was several days before I perceived that most of these girls were young men in hiding from the forced labor conscription, which had grown more ruthless than ever. And still, something in me could not rest until I got back to Haarlem. Nolly was there, of course, but it was the Baye, too, something in the house itself that called me, beckoned me, told me to come home. The problem again was getting there. Willem had the use of an official car for nursing home business, but only within a radius of Hilversum. Finally, after many relayed phone calls, he told me the trip had been arranged. The roads were deserted as we set out. We passed only 2 other cars all the way to the rendezvous spot with the car from Haarlem. Ahead, pulled off onto the snow at the side of the road, we saw it, a long black limousine with official government plates and curtained rear windows. I kissed Willem goodbye and then stepped quickly as instructed into the rear of the limousine. Even in the curtained gloom, the ungainly bulk beside me was unmistakable. Any ideas as to who this is? Herman, I cried. My dear Cornelia. His great hand closed around both of mine. God permits me to see you again. I had last seen Pickwick sitting between two soldiers on the prison bus in The Hague, his poor bald head bruised and bleeding. Now here he was, waving aside my sympathy as though that had been an incident too trivial to recall. He seemed as well informed as ever about everything that went on in Harlem, and as the uniformed driver sped us along the empty roads, he filled me in on all the details that I ached to know. All of our Jews were safe, except Mary Italia, who had been sent to Poland following her arrest in the street. Our group was still operating, although many of the young men were in hiding. He warned me to expect changes in the Bayeux after the police guard had been removed. A series of homeless families had been housed there, although at the moment he believed the living quarters above the shop were empty. Even before the house was unsealed, loyal Toos had returned from Scheveningen and reopened the watch business. Mr. Boykers, the optician next door, had given her space in his shop from which she had taken orders to give to our repairmen in their homes. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I made out my friend's face more clearly. There was perhaps an extra knob or two on his misshapen head. Teeth were missing, but to that vast, kindly ugliness, the beating had made no real difference at all. Now the limousine was threading the narrow streets of Harlem, over the bridge on the Sparna, across the Grote Markt, in the shadow of St. Bravo's, into Borteljoerstraat. I was out of the car almost before it stopped, running down the alley, through the side door, and into Nolly's embrace. She and her girls had been busy all morning, sweeping, washing windows, airing sheets for my homecoming. Over Nolly's shoulder, I saw Toos standing in the rear door to the shop, laughing and sobbing both at once. Laughing because I was home, crying because Father and Betsie, the only two people she had ever allowed herself to love, would never be. Together we trooped through the house and shop, looking, stroking. Remember how Betsie used to set up those cups? Remember how Meta would scold Eusie for leaving his pipe here? I stood on the landing outside the dining room and ran my hand over the smooth wood of the Frisian clock. I could see Father stopping here, Captain at his heels. We mustn't let the clock run down. I opened the glass face, moved the hands to agree with my wristwatch, and slowly drew up the weights. I was home. Life, like the clock, started again. Mornings, repairing watches in the workshop. Noons, most often bumping on my tireless bicycle out to Boos on Hovenstraat. And yet, in a strange way, I was not home. I was still waiting, still looking for something. I spent days prowling the alleys and canal banks nearby, calling Mahershala Hashbaz by name. The elderly vegetable lady 3 stores down told me that the cat had mewed at her door the night of our arrest, and she had taken him in. For months, she said, the small children of the neighborhood had banded together to bring food to Opa's kitty. They had brought scraps from garbage pails and even tidbits from their own scanty plates smuggled past watchful mothers. And Mr. Hashbaz had remained sleek and fat. It was mid-December, she said, when he had not appeared one night to her call, nor had she seen him since. And so I searched, but with a sinking heart, in this winter of Holland's hunger. All my search brought not one single cat or dog to my call. I missed more than the cat. The Bayeux needed people to fill its rooms. I remembered Father's words to the Gestapo chief in The Hague. I will open my door to anyone in need. No one in the city was in greater need than its feeble-minded. Since the start of the Nazi occupation, they'd been sequestered with their families in back rooms, their schools and training centers shut down, hidden from a government that had decided they were not fit to live. Soon a group of them was living at the Bay. They still could not go out on the streets, but here at last they had new surroundings and a program of sorts with the time I could take from the shop. And still my restlessness continued. I was home. I was working and busy. Or was I? Often I would come to with a start at my workbench to realize I had sat for an hour staring into space. The repairmen Toos had found, trained under Father, were excellent. I spent less and less time in the shop. Whatever or whoever I was looking for was not there. Nor upstairs. I loved the gentle people in my care, but the house itself had ceased to be home. For Betsie's sake, I bought plants for every windowsill, but I forgot to water them and they died. Maybe I missed the challenge of the underground. When the national group approached me with a request, I agreed eagerly. They had false release papers for a prisoner in the Harlem jail. What could be simpler than to carry this document around the corner and through those familiar wooden doors? But as the doors closed behind me, my heart began to race. What if I couldn't get out? What if I was trapped? Yes, a young police lieutenant with bright orange hair stepped from behind the reception desk. You had an appointment? It was Rolf. Why was he being so stiff with me? Was I under arrest? Were they going to put me in a cell? Rolf, I said, don't you know me? He peered at me as though trying to refresh his memory. Oh, of course, he said smoothly, the lady at the watch shop. I heard you were closed down for a while. I gaped at him. Why, Rolf knew perfectly. And then I recalled where we were, in the central foyer of the police station with half a dozen German soldiers looking on. And I had greeted one of our group by name, practically admitted a special relationship between us, when the cardinal rule of the underground was... I ran my tongue over my lips. How could I have been so stupid? Ralph took the forged papers from my shaking hands and glanced through them. These must be passed upon by the police chief and the military overcommand together, he said. Can you return with them tomorrow afternoon at 4? The chief will be in a meeting until... I heard no more. After the words tomorrow afternoon, I had bolted to the door. I stood thankfully on the sidewalk until my knees stopped knocking. If I had ever needed proof that I had no boldness or cleverness on my own, I had it now. Whatever bravery or skill I had ever shown were gifts of God, sheer loans from him of the talent needed to do a job. And it was clear from the absence of such skills now that this was no longer his work for me. I crept meekly back to the Bay, and it was at that moment, as I stepped into the alley, that I knew what it was I was looking for. It was Betsie. It was Betsie I had missed every moment of every day since I ran to the hospital window and found that she had left Ravensbrück forever. It was Betsie I had thought to find back here in Harlem, here in the watch shop, in the home she loved. But she was not here. And now, for the first time since her death, I remembered. We must tell people, Corrie. We must tell them what we learned. That very week, I began to speak. If this was God's new work for me, then he would provide the courage and the words. Through the streets and suburbs of Harlem, I bumped on my bicycle rims, bringing the message that joy runs deeper than despair. It was news that people needed to hear, that cheerless spring of 1945. No bride of Harlem trees filled the air with fragrance, only the stump had been too big to haul off for firewood. No tulips turned the fields into carpets of color. The bulbs had all been eaten. No family was without its tragedy. In churches and club rooms and private homes in those desperate days, I told the truths Betsie and I had learned in Ravensbrück. And always at these meetings, I spoke of Betsie's first vision of a home here in Holland where those who had been hurt could learn to live again unafraid. At the close of one of these talks, a slender, aristocratic lady came up to me. I knew her by sight. Mrs. Behrens de Haan, whose home in the suburb of Bloemendaal was said to be one of the most beautiful in Holland. I had never seen it, only the trees at the edge of a huge park in which it was set. So I was astonished when this elegantly dressed lady asked me if I were still living in the ancient little house on Borteljoerstrasse. Yes, how did you... My mother was often told me about it. She went there frequently to see an aunt of yours, who I believe was in charitable work. In a rush, it all came back. Opening the side door to let in a swish of satin and rustle of feathers, a long gown and a plumed hat brushing both sides of the narrow stairs. Then Tante Jan standing at her doorway with a look that froze in the bones the thought of bouncing a ball. I am a widow, Mrs. Behrens de Haan was saying, but I have 5 sons in the resistance. 4 are still alive and well. The 5th we have not heard from since he was taken to Germany. As you spoke just now, something in me kept saying, Jan will come back, and in gratitude you will open your home for this vision of Betsie ten Boom. It was 2 weeks later that a small boy delivered a scented envelope in the side door. Inside, in slanted purple letters, was a single line, Jan is home. Mrs. Behrens de Haan herself met me at the entrance to her estate. Together we walked up an avenue of ancient oaks meeting above our heads. Rounding the final bend, we saw it, a 56-room mansion in the center of a vast lawn. 2 elderly gardeners were poking about the flower beds. We've let the gardens go, Mrs. Behrens de Haan said, but I thought we might put them back in shape. Don't you think released prisoners might find therapy in growing things? I didn't answer. I was staring up at the gabled roof, the leaded windows, such tall, tall windows. Are there, my throat was dry, are there inlaid wood floors inside and a grand gallery around the central hall and bas-relief statues along the walls? Mrs. Behrens de Haan looked at me in surprise. You've been here then? I don't recall. No, I said. I heard about it from... I stopped. How could I explain what I did not understand? From someone who had been here? She finished simply, not understanding my perplexity. Yes, I said, from someone who's been here. That was the other vision that Betsie had, was this magnificent mansion becoming a home to people who had been damaged in the concentration camps. The second week in May, the Allies retook Holland. The Dutch flag hung from every window, and the Willemus was played on the liberated radio day and night. The Canadian Army rushed to the cities, the food they had stockpiled along the borders. In June, the first of many hundreds of people arrived at the beautiful home in Bloemendaal, silent or endlessly relating their losses, withdrawn or fiercely aggressive. Everyone was a damaged human being. Not all had been in concentration camps. Some had spent 2, 3, even 4 years hidden in attic rooms and back closets here in Holland. One of the first of these was Mrs. Kahn, widow of the watch shop owner up the street. Mr. Kahn had died at the underground address. She came to us alone, a stooped, white-haired lady who turned too many pages, who at every sound Others came to Bloemendael, scarred body, soul, by bombing raids or loss of family or any of the endless dislocations of war. In 1947, we began to receive Dutch people who had been prisoners of the Japanese in Indonesia. Though none of this was by design, it proved to be the best possible setting for those who had been imprisoned in Germany. Among themselves, they tended to live and relive their special woes. In Bloemendael, they were reminded that they were not the only ones who had suffered. And for all these people alike, the key to healing turned out to be the same. Each had a hurt he had to forgive. The neighbor who had reported him, the brutal guard, the sadistic soldier. Strangely enough, it was not the Germans or the Japanese that people had the hardest time forgiving. It was their fellow Dutchmen who had sided with the enemy. I saw them frequently in the street. NSBers with their shaved heads and furtive eyes. These former collaborators were now in pitiful condition, turned out of homes and apartments, unable to find jobs, hooted at in the streets. At first, it seemed to me that we should invite them too to Bloemendael, to live side by side with those they had injured, to seek a new compassion on both sides. But it turned out to be too soon for people working their way back from such hurt. The 2 times I tried it, it ended in open fights. And so as soon as homes and schools for the feeble-minded opened up around the country, I turned the Betsie over to these former NSBers. This is how it went those years after the war, experimenting, making mistakes, learning. The doctors, psychiatrists, and nutritionists who came free of charge to any place that cared for war victims sometimes expressed surprise at our loose-run ways. At morning and evening worship, people drifted in and out. Table manners were atrocious. One man took a walk into Harlem every morning at 3 a.m. I could not bring myself to sound a whistle or to scold or consider gates or curfews. And sure enough, in their own time and in their own way, people worked out the deep pain within them. It most often started as Betsie had known it would, in the garden. As flowers bloomed or vegetables ripened, talk was less of the bitter past, more of tomorrow's weather. As their horizons broadened, I could tell them about the people living in the Betsie, people who never had a visitor, never a piece of mail. When mention of the NSBers no longer brought a volley of self-righteous wrath, I knew the people healing was not far away. And the day he said, "These people you spoke of, I wonder if they'd care for some homegrown carrots," then I knew the miracle had happened. I continued to speak, partly because the home in Bloemendael ran on contributions, partly because the hunger for Betsie's story seemed to increase with time. I traveled all over Holland, to other parts of Europe, and to the United States. But the place where the hunger was the greatest was Germany. Germany was a land in ruin, cities of ashes and rubble, but more terrifying still, minds and hearts of ashes. Just across the border was to feel the great weight that hung over that land. It was at a church service in Munich that I saw him. The former SS man who had stood guard at the shower room door in the processing center at Ravensbrück. He was the first of our actual jailers that I had even seen since that time. And suddenly it was all there, the room full of mocking men, the heaps of clothing, Betsie's pain-blanched face. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. "How grateful I am for your message, Fräulein," he said. "To think that, as you say, he has washed my sins away." His hand was thrust out to shake mine, and I, who had preached so often to the people in Bloemendael they needed to forgive, kept my hand at my side. Even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin of them. Jesus Christ had died for this man. Was I going to ask for more? Lord Jesus, I prayed, forgive me and help me to forgive him. I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand. I could not. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. And so again I breathed a silent prayer. Jesus, I cannot forgive him. You must give your forgiveness. As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder along my arm, through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for the stranger that almost overwhelmed me. And so I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness anymore, that on our goodness, that the world's healing hinges, but on his, God's. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives, along with the command, the love itself. It took a lot of love. The most pressing need in post-war Germany was homes. 9 million people were said to be without them. They were living in rubble heaps, half-standing buildings, and abandoned army trucks. A church group invited me to speak to 100 families living in an abandoned factory building. Sheets and blankets had been hung between the various living quarters to make a pretense of privacy, but there was no insulating the sounds. The wail of a baby, the din of radios, the angry words of a family quarrel. How could I speak to these people of the reality of God and then go back to my quiet room in the church hosted outside the city? No, before I could bring a message to them, I would have to have a plan, have to live among them. And it was during the months that I spent in the factory that a director of a relief organization came to see me. They had heard of my rehabilitation work in Holland, he said, and they wondered. I was opening my mouth to say that I had no professional training in such things, when his next words silenced me. We've located a place for the work, he said. It was a former concentration camp that's just been released by the government. We drove to Darmstadt to look at the camp. Rolls of rusting barbed wire still surrounded it. I walked slowly up a cinder path between drab gray barracks. I pushed open a creaking door. I stepped between rows of metal cots. Window boxes, I said. We'll have them at every window. The barbed wire must come down. Of course, then we'll need to paint. Green paint. Bright yellow-green. The color of things coming up in the spring. And that was Betsie's third vision, was that the concentration camps would be converted into places so that the Germans could also heal. That is the end of Corrie ten Boom's story. There is still one chapter, but it is by Elizabeth Sherrell, who is one of the co-authors of the book. And it's called Since Then. Working with the committee on the German Lutheran Church, Corrie opened the camp in Darmstadt in 1946 as a home and a place of renewal. It functioned in this way until 1960, when it was torn down to make room for new construction in a thriving New Germany. The home in Bloemendaal served ex-prisoners and others war victims exclusively until 1950, when it also began to receive people in need of care from the population at large. It is still in operation today, in its own new building with patients from many parts of Europe. Since 1967, it has been governed by the Dutch Reformed Church. Willem died of tuberculosis of the spine in December 1946. He wrote his last book, a study of sacrifice in the Old Testament, standing, because the pain of his illness would not allow him to sit at his desk. Just before his death, Willem opened his eyes to tell Tina, "It is well. It is very well with Keek." It was not until 1953 that the family learned definitively that his 20-year-old son had died in 1944 at the concentration camp in Bergen-Belsen. Today, a tin boom street in Hilversum honors Keek. As a result of his wartime experiences, Peter van Verden, and he's the nephew who was the musician, dedicated his musical gifts to God's service. In addition to composing devotional songs and including a setting for the Psalms and Proverbs, he carried out an international music ministry. He eventually traveled with his wife and 5 children as a family singing group, bearing the message of God's love throughout Europe and the Middle East. In 1959, Corrie was part of a group that visited Ravensbrück, which was then in East Germany, to honor Betsie and the 96,000 other women who died there. There, Corrie learned that her own release had been part of a clerical error. 1 week later, all women her age were taken to the gas chamber. When I heard Corrie speak in Darmstadt in 1968, she was 76, still traveling ceaselessly in obedience to Betsie's certainty that they must tell people. Her work took her to 61 countries, including many unreachable ones on the other side of the Iron Curtain. To whomever she spoke, African students on the shore of Lake Victoria, farmers in a Cuban sugar field, prisoners in an English penitentiary, factory workers in Uzbekistan, she brought the truth the sisters learned in Ravensbrück. Jesus can turn loss into glory. John and I made some of those trips with her, the only way to catch this indefeatable woman long enough to get the information we needed to tell her story. Even with an unscheduled evening ahead of us in some hotel room in Austria or Hungary, it was hard to get her to think back. She was impatient with questions about past events. All her attention centered on next morning's breakfast meeting with local pastors or the coming rally of young people. Oh, those teenagers will be so happy to know that God loves them. Our best talks came during the time she stayed in our home in Chappaqua. Our own teenage kids loved her visits, loved her ability to laugh at herself, like the time the chocolate ice cream from the first cone she had ever eaten kept running down her hand into her blouse and shoes. No, Aunt Corrie, you have to lick around the bottom of the scoop. Watch, like this. Most of all, they loved the fact that each of them was important to her as the loftiest church leaders or city mayor. They loved the simple, concrete way she could convey theological abstractions. I remember the time 13-year-old Liz and I were helping Corrie unpack. From the bottom of the suitcase, Liz lifted a folded cloth with some very amateurish-looking needlework on it. Uneven stitches, mismatched colors, loose threads, snarls. "What are you making?" Liz asked, bewildered. "Oh, that's not mine," Corrie said. "That's the work of the greatest weaver of all." Liz looked dubiously at the tangled mess. "But Liz, you're looking at the wrong side." She took the sorry thing from Liz's hand. "This is what our lives look like from our limited viewpoint." Then with a flourish, Corrie opened the cloth and turned it around to display a magnificent crown, embroidered in red, purple, and gold. But when we turn over the threads of our lives to God, this is what He sees. In her mid-80s, failing health brought an end to Corrie's missionary journeys. Friends provided Corrie a retirement home in Orange County, California. But of course, even bedridden and for the last 5 years unable to speak, Corrie never stopped witnessing to God's love. You would come to cheer her up, but you would be the one who would leave that silent bedroom, spirit mysteriously and gloriously renewed. At 11 at night on her 91st birthday, April 15th, 1983, Corrie, in the phrase she always used, went home at last. For readers of Guidepost who had followed Corrie's adventures, and for myself most of all, I wrote down my reaction to the news of her death. I tried to be glad for Corrie when the phone called from California. She'd waited for her homecoming so long. But death from the perspective of Earth means saying goodbye. Feeling my loss, I roamed our house, touching one by one the physical objects she'd given us over the years. An antique brass kettle, a small square picture frame, an even smaller round one. Little things that recalled big truths our friend shared. The kettle spoke to me about priorities. It was Betsie who'd spied it, dented and soot-ridden, in a junkyard one morning on her way to the market. She bought it with the meat money. "Betsie," cried Corrie, coming upstairs from the watch shop, "what are we going to do with that old thing? It won't even hold water." "Well, it's not meant to hold water," Betsie replied with dignity. "Well, what's it for then?" "It's not for anything." "Oh, Corrie, wait till I get the grime off. Can't you see the morning sun glowing on that spout?" "I got stew meat instead of a roast," she hurried on. "You know, stew is really easier for Father to chew, and I'm not hungry today." "Oh, Corrie, this kettle will go on shining long after we've forgotten what we had for dinner tonight." And so it did. It shone for the hunted people who found shelter in the Begay. It shone for Corrie when she returned there alone from the concentration camps, and from her tireless trips to Russia, China, Vietnam. It shines in our home today, saying, what feeds the soul matters as much as what feeds the body. In the square frame, a piece of yellow cloth cut in the shape of a six-pointed star. Across the star, 4 black letters, J-O-O-D, the Dutch word for Jew. When I was in Holland researching Corrie's story, she took me to the home of Meyer Moselle, or Eusie, during the Nazi occupation. We sipped tea while Corrie and Eusie reminisced. "You take your pipe with you," Corrie reminded him, recalling the practice details, "but you'd forget the ashtray, and I'd have to come running after you." Eusie set down his cup and crossed the room to a massive antique sideboard. From the bottom drawer, buried beneath the pile of table linen, he drew out a scrap of yellow cloth cut in the shape of a star. "All these years I wondered why I saved this thing," he said. "Now I know it was to give to you, Corrie." We picked out the frame for Eusie's star that very afternoon. For years it hung on Corrie's wall as it hangs now on ours, a symbol, bittersweet as a cross. To me, the star says whatever is in our lives is hardest to bear, love can transform it into beauty. And the little round frame, it holds a piece of cloth too. Ordinary white cloth, the kind underwear is made of. In fact, it is underwear. A fragment of the undershirt Corrie was wearing when the Gestapo raid came. In solitary confinement in the prison in Scheveningen, the first place she was taken after her arrest, idleness was eroding Corrie's courage. Nolly smuggled a needle and thread to her, but soon the thread was used up. Then Corrie remembered the undershirt. She unraveled a hem, and now animals, houses, faces. She covered the undershirt with embroidery. The design in the round frame is a flower with elegant curling edges, 6 leaves on a graceful stem. You have to look closely to see the flowers, and the thread, of course, is the same color as the cloth. Well, it isn't the most costly of the things Corrie gave us, but it is the one that spoke most clearly now that she was gone. A circle of white cotton told me when we're feeling poorest, when we've lost a friend, when a dream has failed, when we seem to have nothing left in the world to make life beautiful. That's when God says, "You're richer than you think." Elizabeth Sherrell, Chappaqua, New York, September 2005. And there is one last picture. For a short time in the 1970s, Corrie's home in Haarlem, Holland was a museum. Corrie stands in front of the hiding place. The hole in the bricks is for visitors to see inside the hiding place more easily. The original entrance is through the bottom of the closet. Since 1988, the Corrie Ten Boom house is once again an inspiring museum. So this is Corrie, and this is supposed to be a place for people to just look in. That isn't the way it was when they were there. And here is the place that the people entered. So they'd have to get down on their hands and knees and crawl to get to that space behind the wall. Okay, that's the end of the book. I hope you enjoyed it and that you got something out of it. Bye-bye.